program, and it's my pleasure to introduce a friend who will make the introduction. I first met Dave Anderson in 1992 when he was working on the Clinton campaign here in Little Rock. If you watch the movie, the documentary, The War Room, you will find him playing a big role in the development of the communication strategy. He brought new media. Now, back in 1992, when cell phones were this big, he still brought new media, new concepts to the campaign. He later went on to work in the Clinton White House before moving on to MTV, where he was in charge of the effort to register and recruit young voters. And there he met our guest speaker, and they developed a good friendship. After taking a class, he majored in history and film in college, but after taking a class in photography and studying it, he decided to go into photography big time, and he has done exceedingly well. One of his work's been in Esquire, it's been on ESPN. He's one of the major photography organizations, ranked him as one of the 30 emerging young photographers in the country. But most recently, his book, Rough Beauty, which is a powerful photographic essay of life in a small Texas town, a town that had been known for its longtime affiliation with the KKK. And Dave does this fabulous book, Rough Beauty. He tells me in advance of the New York Times, he says, they're going to review my book in the New York Times. This is several months ago. It's going to be in Sunday's paper. Be sure and look at it. Well, I expected, a little short column in the New York Times. But the truth of the matter is it was a full-page review of this book, and it has attracted great attention. His work is on display at numerous museums around the country, including the Ogden Museum of Southern Art in New Orleans. He is one of the most talented young photographers in the country. We're honored that he lives in Little Rock with his wife and little boy Noah. He does some work with us here at the Clinton School, and he's been a great resource to us, both from the picture viewpoint, but in suggesting speakers like the one we're having today. Would you welcome Dave Anderson?
Thank you, Skip. First of all, I just want to say, as a relatively new resident in Little Rock, it's just an incredible pleasure to have the Clinton School and the Clinton Library here. And the speaker series here is one of the things, I told Skip this recently, it's one of the things that really makes me excited and feel like I'm a part of a town that has real vibrancy and excitement going on within its borders. So I just want to thank you guys, all the people here, Patrick and Skip and Nikolai and everyone, for all the work they do to bring such interesting speakers from around the world here. Let's see, in late 1995, I was hired away from the White House to work at MTV, and just as I began there, I ended up sharing an office with a guy named MacAdams, and we hit it off immediately and got each other's phone calls because our extensions were almost identical. And I was on the road a lot, but it didn't prevent us from, becoming closer and closer over the years. Ocean is originally from San Francisco, a small town. I wouldn't call it a suburb. It's a little too out there to call it a burb. It's called Bolinas, a town where they don't like outsiders coming in, so much so that they keep pulling down the city limit sign so no one will know where they are. And a beautiful place. And he has, in the years since leaving there, he's managed to marry his high school sweetheart, and they have a 17-month-old, and she's beautiful. Anyway, Ocean started out, he went to Columbia University in New York and studied urban studies, perfect major for a life in television. and then got a job at VH1 and worked there for a little while, and then moved over to MTV. And he worked his way up. He started as a booker, trying to line up various musicians and political figures to make appearances on MTV. And over the years, he just kept getting elevated. His wonderful attitude, his hard work, and his decency and all-around intelligence really, I think, created a lot of goodwill around the channel. And now he has been elevated. He was elevated first to head writer, and then he has now been named senior vice president of MTV News, a 150-person department, and he runs everything, including their election coverage. So I would like to now introduce Ocean, and so he can tell you all about it.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. It's also an honor to be introduced by Dave Anderson, who is not only a dear friend of mine, but also someone who I really admire. I always talk about Dave as, Dave is someone who so far has already had 3 incredibly successful careers and has really never been afraid to try something new. And his photography career is a testament to the fact that, doesn't matter where you are in your stage of life, you can always try something new and be a huge success, so it's really an honor. And he's also a fantastic friend in that he brought me barbecue today. I'm a huge barbecue fan, even though I grew up in California and live in New York. I'll get on a plane, for good barbecue. And I was so bummed when I got here yesterday, and I hadn't realized that on Sunday every place is closed. So Sim's was closed, and Whole Hog was closed. I was so disappointed. And I know that when I get back to New York, the first thing my wife's going to say is, "How was the barbecue?" And I was so afraid that I was going to have to tell her I didn't even eat any barbecues. But luckily, Dave just brought me Sim's about 15 minutes ago, which is great because I love barbecue. Bad because now I feel like I may have to take a nap at some point relatively soon. But thank you so much again for having me, and thank you so much for the Clinton School for having me here. I've had actually a bit of a Clinton weekend already. I've had a great opportunity this week. As you might know, the Clinton Global Initiative has been meeting, or was meeting all last week in New York City. And they finished up the week with a gala event at the Apollo Theater up in Harlem. And MTV and the Clinton Global Initiative are working together on a number of projects. They actually asked me to produce the event at the Apollo, and it was really just a fantastic night. It's funny, I was saying this earlier. There were a lot of stars there that night. Bono was there, and Chris Rock was there, and Shakira performed, and Wyclef performed, and Alicia Keys performed. Sorry, but even amongst all those celebrities, Bill Clinton is still the biggest rock star in the game. There's no doubt about it. Although I was so bummed. In all my years covering politics at MTV, I've never actually met him, and I've always wanted to just shake his hand, say hi, And there was a reception before the event, and I had to go down to the satellite truck, and I was counting the moments, and everyone was, he was supposed to be there, and he was running a little bit late. Some of you may have experienced that, but I was counting down like the last second I had to before I had to go back to our production truck before he got there. And I finally just said, I got to go down because the show's going to start and no one's going to be there to produce it. And apparently, like 30 seconds after I left, he showed up and did the room. So I didn't get to meet him, but I get to, be at his school, which is pretty cool too. So again, I'm here to talk about, obviously I wear a number of hats at MTV, and as I'll talk about, we cover a lot. Obviously, the heart and soul of what we do is music news, but we also, every 4 years we cover the presidential campaigns, and under our the title Choose or Lose. You may hear, I know some people get confused sometimes. They confuse us with Rock the Vote, which is an independent organization. Sometimes people say, hey, how about that vote or die thing you guys did? And again, that's not MTV, that was Puffy, that was his campaign. But our election coverage is called Choose or Lose. And we've got a lot of really exciting things planned for 2008 that I'm here to talk about. But before I kind of get into that, I want to talk a little bit about MTV News. Just take a step back. I won't bore you with all the details about MTV, but I kind of wanted to just take a second to talk a little bit about who we are, what we do, what we don't do, what our kind of core mission is. As Dave mentioned, we have about 150 people, the bulk of which are in New York City. some of which are also in Los Angeles. We have about 5 on-air reporters right now. We've got Kurt Loder still there, John Norris, Sujin Pak, Kim Stoltz, and Sway Calloway. And we've got a part-timer in LA named Liz Hernandez. And really, our department is interesting. It's really evolved a lot since I started MTV. Pretty much, when I started MTV, MTV News was what we did on MTV. It was John Norris, Tabitha Soren, and Kurt Loder. And we did the Week in Rock. We did some daily news, and that was MTV News. Today, we've pretty much evolved into almost a semi-independent production unit within the MTV Networks family. MTV and MTV Networks are a global leviathan with their fingers in pretty much everywhere, or maybe tentacles, if you want to use that term, everywhere. Basically, what our department has evolved into is we produce content that we share with all of the MTV Networks families in any kind of shape or form that people want it in. So again, when I started, it was MTV News on MTV, and I have to look at my list because I wrote this down. So today, right now, we currently produce news for MTV, MTV2, MTVU, which is a college network that we have that unless you went to a MTVU college, you wouldn't even know existed, but it's a huge channel. We recently launched a channel called MTV Trace, which is specifically targeted at Latinos in the United States. It's an Hispanic audience. It's in English, but it's for Latinos. We produced up until very recently a magazine show for Logo, which is a channel that MTV launched recently for the gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender community. And we also actually, MTV produced for Logo the first presidential forum that was targeted to gay and lesbian issues. We also supply hours and hours of content to MTVs around the globe. As you probably are aware, currently MTV has, I think, about 102 branded MTVs around the world. That doesn't even include Nickelodeons and VH1s. But they're everywhere from MTV Canada to next month we're launching MTV Arabia. Last month they launched MTV Turkey, and I think MTV Ukraine is launching very soon. Pretty much now, I think we are now, with the launch of MTV Arabia, and last year with MTV Base Africa, which is based out of Johannesburg, we are now, you can pretty much get MTV in every country in the world. Every place on the planet has access to MTV. And a lot of those stations are very small. The general philosophy of MTV is that they control, that's programmed locally by local folks who understand the tastes of the local audience, but they don't have the production facilities. And we provide a lot of access to artists and a lot of access to presidential candidates and things like that. And so a lot of our material we feed our material out to the MTVs around the world. And I was saying before, it's such an interesting experience if you're traveling and I turn on an MTV and it's, hey, I produced that, but they've translated into a whole different language. It's really fascinating. Another little fact about MTV, and someone was asking me about this earlier, and it's not part of my speech, but I thought I might, someone was asking me what the #1 most popular piece of content on all of MTVs around the world, and it's Pimp My Ride. It's the most popular show around the world, and you can understand why, no matter where you are, if you're a young person, you like cars, and the car culture it's everywhere. And literally, it is by apparently leaps and bounds the most popular show internationally. Within the United States, it's The Hills, which I can also talk about maybe another time. And again, that's just television. We also, MTV News, we've got a huge website, mtvnews.com. We supply news for vh1.com. We have a daily podcast that pretty much focuses on music news. That is apparently the #1 music podcast internationally on iTunes. We have a daily news update that's only for wireless. We've also got, crazily enough, 2 short-form series that only exist on mobile phones with our wireless partners. We've got a very robust business, a video-on-demand business with our cable partners. We have a bureau of MTV News on virtual MTV. There's a whole virtual MTV out there. What am I missing? Oh, and we recently launched MTV News on the Xbox Live channel. So if you're playing Xbox and you want to get the latest on an artist, you can go there. And the reality behind this is that our audience has, especially in the past 10 years, has had an explosion in opportunities of choice, of platforms, of screens, and it is our mission, it is our goal to be everywhere our audience is, and so we have to be flexible and we have to be able to move very quickly onto new platforms, and we've tried our best to do that. Keeping in mind, however, as we talk about what MTV is doing for our political coverage, that despite all these new opportunities, despite all these new screens, the TV screen is still the king. In terms of exposure, in terms of impact, it's still the mothership that is MTV. It's still the number one place to be. Although, for how long, I'm not sure. All these other screens are growing so rapidly that if I came back and gave this speech a couple years from now, I might not be saying the same thing. The last thing I kind of wanted to say about MTV News before I begin is that when we're talking about our political coverage, one of the key things to remember about MTV is that MTV covers politics by choice. There's no necessarily reason why MTV has to do it. If you ask someone from ABC News or the Arkansas Democratic Gazette, covering politics is part of their core mission. It's part of the reason they exist. MTV News never started out that way. MTV News, our original mandate and still the heart and soul of what we do is actually music news. And while the channel probably isn't the music outlet that it once was, MTV News still considers the heart and soul of what we do to be music news. And any given time, during an average day, probably 70% of what we do is music news. That shifts a little bit during the election season, but it's still, it's still the thing to do. We had no mandate originally to cover politics. We certainly don't do it for the ratings. We do fine in the ratings. I have nothing to apologize for, and everyone's very happy with it. And I'm always surprised at how well a lot of our political coverage does. We just did an event with Edwards that I'll talk about that did shockingly well. But the reality is that the Hills still pays my salary. We choose to do politics because we think it's important. MTV thinks it's the right thing to do. They think that it's that it's part of our job to help young people get informed about the issues around them. But the other thing that we certainly do not believe is we certainly do not think that we're a replacement for getting your news anyplace else. Every once in a while, someone will throw out a poll, which I don't really believe, that say that young people say they only get their news from MTV, Jay Leno, and Stephen Colbert, or something like that. And I have, we strongly believe that if that's the only place you're getting your news from, you are woefully underinformed. We do not consider ourselves a replacement from the traditional news outlets. However, on the other hand, we also know that given our audience, when the presidential election cycle starts up, a good portion, if not the majority of our audience, has never voted before. They are turning 18, and this is their first opportunity. And we do think it's a responsibility of ours to get them the basics. One of the the hallmarks of our coverage is that we've always felt that, we don't assume any knowledge. We don't think our audience is unintelligent. We don't think our audience is capable. We don't think our audience can grasp all the major political issues. But we don't want to assume that they necessarily know everything. We don't want to assume that they know what a primary is. We don't want to assume they know what a delegate is. And I think that if there is something that sets us apart a little bit from what a CNN does or a Fox News does, it's that we do feel that a lot of the 101 stuff is part of our core mission. And so I think sometimes when people who aren't of our demo watch some of our coverage, they'll say, oh, well, you just did the basics. We did this event with Edwards last week, again, that I'll talk about. Overall, it was really widely, I think, praised, but there were some criticisms that, he was just giving his typical stump speech, or he gave some of the answers he's given in other places. I see the ratings for the debates on MSNBC and CNN and Fox, and I know what their numbers are in the 18 to 24 demographic group, and it could probably fit. But no, that's an exaggeration. But there are a lot of people that are not seeing. So when they are seeing him talk about his position on the war for the first time, his position on higher education for the first time, there's a decent part of our audience that has not seen that before, that doesn't know that. And so we firmly believe that some of that 101 stuff is a key part of what we do. So let's get into it a little bit. So choose or lose. That's what we're here for. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the challenges that we face first. MTV, first of all, MTV no longer really has the playing field to itself. It's funny, when MTV first started covering politics in 1992, I know you all can't read that, so I'm going to talk my way through it. So, first of all, when MTV started covering, when Dave Anderson helped us cover the election in 1992, it was really remarkable that anybody like MTV was covering it. There were the major players, and that was pretty much it. So all of a sudden us covering politics, just period, broke through. 4 years later, 8 years later, when Dave and I were working on the campaign, we'd go to the conventions, and the WWF would have wrestlers covering the convention. The Comedy Central started doing stuff. Spike TV started covering things. Country music television. The explosion in what I'd call alternative media has really exploded. And obviously now the digital landscape is so changed. There's just so many more players in the game, and it's really harder for any one entity to break through. And obviously we want to make an impact, and we want to get famous for what we do. And so it's always a bit challenging to break through. The other thing another challenge that we always have is our own legacy. 1992 was lightning in a bottle. MTV was new and fresh on the scene. Bill Clinton was new and fresh on the scene. And the president, really embraced MTV and used, I think, MTV to get his message out to a new generation of voters. At the time, the other side didn't embrace MTV as much. I think we have been, since then, identified with helping President Clinton get, rightly or wrongly, helping President Clinton get elected. And so since then, we've both had to deal with the fact that was so successful and such a breakthrough that a lot of times people spend some time thinking about, oh man, wasn't it so great back in 1992? Can we ever do that again? And so we have to spend a lot of time putting that aside, not getting nostalgic and looking forward. And then the other issue it's a legitimate issue, and I'm not afraid to talk about it publicly, is that we have a little bit more of sometimes a struggle making sure that both sides are fully represented on MTV, and not because of our own personal preference, but we do have a bit of a challenge every year getting the Republicans to play ball as much as we'd like. I think there's some cultural reasons, obviously, with MTV. I think there's a bit of an identification with Clinton going backwards. But I have a very, very good feeling about 2008. We've had some fantastic conversations with the Republican candidates, and I think you're going to be seeing most, if not all of them, on our air in a pretty big way, which we're really excited about. The battle for airtime, it's something that every news outlet faces, as I said. MTV is still the mothership. It's still where we have the most impact. And, I work for a public company, and that public company gets paid for having highly rated shows on the air. And if it's always a struggle to make sure that you get all of your political coverage aired, especially when you're going up against things like, Newport Beach and the hills and things like that. Luckily, for the most part, our stuff has done very well. But again, it's always a push and pull. And then finally, I called it the Rock the Vote era, and I realized when I saw that people might interpret that as some sort of slight against the organization Rock the Vote, and that's not what I mean at all. They're still a very vital organization. But a lot of what we have done in the past was trying to find musicians and artists talk about politics. Something we spent quite a bit of time on. And, some are better than others. Obviously, there's some people who are incredibly eloquent and educated on the issues, and some that aren't. But I think in general, that era has ended. I think there's a lot less interest amongst our audience in seeing, I'm going to throw out bands here that some people here might know and some people not, but seeing the All-American Rejects talk about politics. Not because they're a bad band or not smart, but just I think there's a different relationship, I think, between some of the bigger artists and our audience. That kind of whole idea of sending, we sent Jewel one year to do the convention floor, and we did a lot of stuff with Chuck D. That kind of stuff has really come in. We've really moved past that, and you're certainly not going to see nearly as much of that on the air as you have in the past. Not to say that we don't work with musicians and other entertainers when appropriate. I was just seeing Bono speak the other night, but I think you're going to see less of that. It's less of a core focus of what we do. So what are we doing? If there's one kind of buzzword that you're going to hear me talk a little bit about, and you'll hear from MTV over the next year, it's all about empowerment. It's all about giving the tools to our audience to get informed, to make a difference in their local community, to find other people who share their like interests. It's giving them the tools to report, if they want to, on the issues that matter to them. Empowerment's a big, big theme in what we're doing. And if there's kind of 4 touchstones, I'll just read them out. Number 1 is use new media tools to create unique opportunities for our audience to directly interact with candidates, and we'll talk about that in a second. Empower young people to report on their issues of deepest concern in every state in the District of Columbia. Launch the first ever multimedia youth activist community. And obviously use MTV's on-air exposure as the ultimate reward. Nice overarching goals. Let me talk about some specifics. Real-time access to the candidates. Very, very excited. Last week was the first of what we hope will be a series of presidential dialogues that we had with the candidates. We have partnered with MySpace on a series of dialogues in which we combine some of the elements of a traditional town hall meeting with, I think, some really fascinating new media tools. So what did we do? On Thursday, with Senator John Edwards, we had an event at the University of New Hampshire where we had 300 students in a field house on a really cool MTV set that we built. And the candidate came, answered questions both from the audience, also from people at home using IM. And also, we had a really interesting polling tool that we built with MySpace. It actually ended up not looking like this. I built this slide about 2 weeks ago, and since that time, we completely overhauled the look and feel of the polling widget. But basically, what we did was, so the town hall was aired live on MTV.com and on MySpace.com, and then later in the day on MTV. But during the live stream, you could actually vote on what you thought about the senator's answers. So if you felt that the senator was dodging the question, if you felt the senator was being honest, if you felt like you'd heard it all before, you were able to give him honest and real-time feedback. We didn't actually put the polling tool up in front of Edwards all the time, because then he would literally be seeing a pie chart. It was actually ended up being a pie chart like move. But we did about 5 or 6 times during the afternoon. We actually said to him, Senator, I want to go back to your question on Iraq. We've been polling our audience at home, and here's what they thought about it. X% say you really answered it, and they're right with you. And it was fascinating. We have a lot of kinks to work out. It's an evolving thing, but it was really a fascinating real-time experience. I think a lot of people watched the CNN YouTube debates, which I thought were a big success. I think they did a great job. But it was still a one-way experience. And what we were really trying to do with MySpace is to make it a two-way, to make it a real dialogue. And it's funny because it's so rare for young people to be able to get access to the candidates, except, and I have a funny story about this, if you live in New Hampshire. It was really fascinating. We were casting the audience. We wanted to get 300 people, and you want to make sure you've got a variety of viewpoints and you've got a diverse crew of people. And so we had a booth set up. We were talking to kids about why they wanted to be there. And it was actually fascinating. If you're a young person in New Hampshire and you're politically motivated or involved at all, meeting a political candidate is like, oh yeah, Edwards was bugging me at breakfast yesterday. I've already talked to him. I mean, I think if you live in New Hampshire or Iowa, you literally get to meet every candidate like 5 times before the primary. I mean, it's shocking. But let's say 90% of the population doesn't really get that. And so what we're really trying to do is create an interaction that you can actually both ask questions and also give feedback to the candidates. It went great. We did it with Edwards. We've gotten some, all the other candidates had committed to it, but as you all know in politics, nobody ever says no to an interview. They just never find the time to schedule it. But all the other candidates have already agreed to do it, and we're about to firm up 2 more, I think, over the next 48 hours. So I think everyone was kind of waiting to see how it went with Edwards. But it went great, and we're getting some really positive feedback. Street Team 08, 51 local journalists. Every year that we do Choose or Lose, every 4 years, we try to come up with something new, something that no one else has done before. Dave did the Choose or Lose bus, which at the time was like the first wrapped bus. No one really did that, and Dave traveled around the country. In 2000, we had an idea called the Street Team. We hired young journalists right out of college, one of them who was Gideon Yago. And we give them digital cameras. The digital technology was just beginning, and we put them out in the campaign. We sent them out in different places and said, report back what you find. But it was an idea ahead of its time. Honestly, the biggest problem was they got so much great stuff, we didn't know what to do with it. There's just so many hours in the day that you can. There's so much time you can have on air. And so it was. I think people liked it, but people felt like there just wasn't an outlet. Well, now there is an outlet. At the time, there was just one linear television station. But now, we have so much time, so much space to fill, that we can really allow people to go in depth. So we're actually partnering with the Knight Foundation, which is an organization that promotes journalism, and we're actually hiring young people in every single state and in the District of Columbia. We're paying them I mean, it's not a full-time job, but it's, there is payment. We're giving them a camera, a computer, some travel money, some editing software. We're bringing them to New York for a big training session. And we're basically going to have 51 journalists reporting on how the national election is playing out in their state. Obviously, they're going to be covering, if they live in a swing state, there's going to be a lot of national issues going on. There's going to be a lot of candidates coming in town. But we also know that for our audience, a lot of the issues that are most affecting their lives are not necessarily presidential issues, but local issues, school board races, mayoral races, gubernatorial races. And so we are basically going to be having 2 or 3 stories a week from those young journalists in any shape or form they want. They can be audio only, they can be full video, they can be copy, they can be blog entries. And we are just going through the applications right now. We've had hundreds of applications, and it's just really exciting. It's just such a fascinating, awesome group of people. If you ever get cynical about, I don't ever get cynical, but I know people sometimes poo-poo the next generation. Oh, they're not serious enough, they don't care, blah, blah, blah. I can send you about 1,000 applications of people who were so motivated and so interesting and interested. It really, it pains me that we're going to have to pare it down to 51. But the recruitment's underway for them. We're planning on launching that in January. Multimedia activist community. What we're calling internally the Thinkubator. We've been working on this for a couple of years now. We're working with a lot of outside organizations, and including the Bill and Gates Foundation and a number of large foundations. We just came out of beta. It is basically a small targeted social network aimed at young people and activism. Certainly not a competitor to a Facebook or a MySpace. Those are fantastic businesses that are all doing great things. But the idea being that it's basically a social network where you can go, you can find other like-minded young people who may have similar interests that you. You can find out how to get involved. You can talk about what are the issues that are important to you. You can upload any of your multimedia material. We have access to the candidates. We've got access to all the issues. It's a place to find out how and where you can get involved. It's really exciting. Again, we just launched, and we're already starting to get a lot of positive feedback on it. And I would encourage everyone to check it out at think.mtv.com. Another thing that we're doing with the Knight Foundation is we're working on a big contest with them. The Knight Foundation is giving a $500,000 grant on a big idea to drive citizen journalism and activism at the local level. And throughout the year, we're going to be featuring people who are applying for this. We'll be featuring some of the finalists, and there'll be some big event once the winner is announced, and MTV is going to be pretty involved with that. And we're certainly, anything, not necessarily even the winning idea, but if there are other fantastic ideas that can help inform our campaign, we're going to be using those people and using their ideas in our coverage. So we're really excited about that. Again, that's just beginning to ramp up now. But as we said, MTV on air is still the ultimate reward. One of the challenges that we have is that a lot of the great stuff that we're getting now is what we call short form content. When MTV first launched, MTV aired videos. And so MTV News evolved initially as a short form thing, 3-4 minute segment. And it was easy because it happened to be the length of music videos. So you could pull a music video out and you could air 4 minutes. As MTV has become much more of a channel station, it's harder. You need to have a half hour worth of material, and that's tough. You don't always have a half hour, and we don't have a weekly or nightly show anymore where we can highlight this. So we've been very frustrated. Sometimes we get a great 4 or 5 minutes, but how do we put that on air? And so what we've actually done for what we're doing for 2008 is we're having what we're calling the E-Spot. That name is still to be TBD. We're still working on that. But the idea being that it's at one time across all of our channels, MTV, MTV2, MTVU, and MTV Trace, very specific time slot. When it's going to be on every night. And it's of all the things that we're doing out there, it's the best of. So if one of our street team folks come up with a fantastic piece that's 3 minutes long, or even something shorter, that's where it goes. If on our Think community site someone has done something really fantastic that we want to highlight, but again you wouldn't put into a half-hour show, that's where it's going to be. The idea being that it's the bubble up idea. It's the being that you're being rewarded with national exposure for what you're doing. Because again, as we talked about, there's still nothing like being on television. And then the final thing that we're planning on doing are our issue specials. We still try to do our shows. We probably, in 2008, we'll probably do about 7 to 10 issue-oriented specials. I think we always struggle with our long-form shows. How do we do something that someone else isn't doing? How do we break through? Sometimes we succeed and sometimes we don't succeed. But I think we've got some really fantastic ideas for the next 12 months. Some of the shows that we've done in the past that we're really proud of. One of the things that one of the kind of the hallmarks of our coverage is that we always try to break things down into a very local level. So if it's a story, and we also try to give action items. So if we're doing something on global poverty, it's such a massive problem that I think if you're at home, and especially if you're 17 years old, you just get overwhelmed by the enormity of the issue, or the enormity or the scale of the problem. And so when we do our global poverty stuff, we spend a lot of time talking about small steps, small things that you can do. And when it comes to our political specials, we try to really break it down into how it affects individual people. So for instance, globalization. That's something that when we do all of our research, thing that comes up that is massive to our audience. How does it affect our lives? How do we do that? How do we really show it? So for us, it's all about telling individual stories. So what we did for globalization is we found a call center in Ohio where somebody was losing their job. The call center was being outsourced to India. So we followed this young man as he lost his job, and we followed him as he had a young family, he had a young child and a wife. He ended up getting the job, which was great, but it took a while. He had a bit of a lower standard of living. So we followed and showed his experience, but we also followed the job itself. We actually followed that specific job to a call center in India and showed the person who got his job. And it turned out to be, it was actually a young woman. And in India, a lot of these call centers are actually are having a very fascinating effect on Indian culture, one of which is that a lot of young women who otherwise would go into a very young and early marriage are getting jobs for the first time. And it's a huge liberating force in Indian culture. And so we followed her life as well and how the effect of that job had on her life. And then we actually showed each of them the tapes of each other. And so, I think that was a really effective way of breaking down a large issue into a very small, understandable way. And so you're going to see a lot about that. Frankly, I think a lot of the issues that are important to our audience are the issues you'd expect. The war in Iraq is going to be huge for us in 2008. 70%, I think 70% is a latest research. 70% of our audience either has a friend or a family member in the military. It's obviously our audience that's doing the fighting and the dying in the war. Obviously, the environment's become a huge issue for our audience, and one that wouldn't be as important for the larger audience, but is huge for us, is the cost of higher education. It's fascinating. When we were in New Hampshire and we were casting the show, we didn't screen questions. We didn't ask people what they were going to ask, but we did ask what topic they wanted to talk about, just so we could make sure that we were representing what the big concerns in the room were. And we also took questions from in advance online about what people wanted to hear the senator talk about. And obviously the war in Iraq, the war on terror, was high up there. But the number one question that people wanted to ask about was paying for higher education and debt. It's if you haven't seen the research, the amount, and I know there's people here who probably are in the middle of it, the level of debt that people are coming out of college now is just unprecedented, and it limits people's choices, obviously. It puts people into sometimes puts them into a cycle and a lifetime of debt, and it is becoming it's a giant issue for our audience, something that we're going to be covering a lot. Another big issue for our audience is healthcare, which you wouldn't think for young people would be a big issue, but it comes up more and more. I think as more people are coming out of high school and college, getting their first or second job, they're beginning to see some of the issues that this country's having with healthcare. It's a tougher issue for us. It's hard to break that down, but we're going to be working on it a lot. And that is pretty much I think the main issues that we're going to be talking about. There's obviously other things that we deal with throughout the year, but those right now are some of the targets for us. So that's pretty much our plan. I talked a little bit about a timeline here. We traditionally we start our political coverage in January, February of the election year. Like everybody else, we're dealing with the fact that we're now in a permanent presidential campaign. It seems like. Normally we'd be getting ready in January and February, But now, I mean, it literally feels like, by the time February ends, we're going to know who our candidates are. So we've had to really kind of backload things and launch a lot earlier than we traditionally would have. Normally, like these MySpace things we're doing, we would have never done that before the new year. But now we're probably going to be done with all the candidates by then. But we're excited. Things are all coming together, and we're hoping we're going to have a big impact. Just finally, the kind of last thing I'd like to say about our audience. I definitely, I don't hear a lot of cynicism from our audience about people being involved, but I certainly hear a lot of it from people who aren't in the demo anymore. Does your audience really care? Aren't you guys just doing this to make yourself feel better? You feel bad about Made, so you want to do this show. The reality is that, listen, we know that young people don't vote in the same proportions that older people vote. But in the last election, 21 million people under the age of 30 voted. More people under the age of 30 voted than they ever had before. And every poll that we're seeing is that people are more engaged this time, are more interested, and I fully expect to see record numbers of voters. I've said this before, but if there is one constant that I think has always been there, is that the older generation always thinks the younger generation doesn't take things seriously and doesn't care, and it'll always be that way. And I have a 17-month-old daughter, and I'm sure when she's 17, I'll lecture her about when I was a kid, everybody was involved, and now you guys don't. All you care about is your computer games or whatever. But I have a lot of faith in our audience and a lot of faith in the next generation, and I'm really, really excited for 2008. So, thank you. So apparently,
we have
can
time
ask
for some questions.
All right.
About 20 minutes or
Britney
so.
Spears of the VMAs.
So we're passing around a couple of mics. Just raise your hand if you want to ask a question, and we will give you a question. So we'll start with you. Here you go.
What's MTV doing to cover the issue of military draft being a possibility?
Yeah, obviously that came up pretty big in the last election. It's obviously a huge concern of ours. All the polls that we've done, and the same polls you guys have probably all seen, is that our audience is very opposed to the return of the draft. But again, I think so is the military. But we're on it. I am putting aside my job. I personally would be shocked if it happened, but we'll see. I have a feeling that if the draft came back, you would see activism at a level unheard of since the last time there was a military draft in this country. I think that has a way of attuning the mind, but I personally don't see it. But you never know. Yeah, sure.
I'm really asking that in the context of some of the issues you mentioned, like healthcare and education. And do you think that a large majority of young people today are feeling like they're pressured to enter the military to satisfy some of the problems they have with education and paying for it, or health care, and their future in general for being employed or anything like that in some of the communities they come from?
Do I think that young people are feeling specifically pressured to go in the military? I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, it seems to me from the recruitment numbers I've seen that they're actually having a harder time getting people to go into the military right now. So I don't know if they're feeling extra pressure to do it. I certainly can see how it might be a viable option if you're looking to pay for college. But I haven't seen that a lot. But I can certainly, I can see what you're saying.
Mr. MacAdams, my name is James Mitchell. I'm a student
By the way, I don't think I've ever been called Mr. MacAdams. But sorry.
I'm a student here, and thank you very much.
I don't even wear a tie ever, so
Thank you for coming to speak with us. As you said, MTV News is a subsidiary of a major multinational corporation.
Yep.
And in regards to that, do you feel any organizational pressure towards biasing your coverage or putting preference towards a specific candidate?
I don't, and it's certainly, bias in our coverage is something I think about a lot. I think, I've never felt any sort of institutional problems. And honestly, if I did ever feel a problem, I don't think it would ever be a particular candidate. It's more like, the thing you're always more concerned about is if ICOM wants to get into China, so don't, tread lightly on Tibet. That's the kind of horror stories you hear, but I've never seen it. We did a massive, back a number of years ago, there was a series of concerts to free Tibet, and it was certainly something we talked about, but we never, in the end, never felt any sort of pressure. As far as like bias in general, I would be lying to you if I said that our newsroom probably wasn't institutionally probably a little bit more liberal than the mainstream of the United States. And by the way, I'd say that's the same thing of pretty much every newsroom out there. But I think it's my job to make sure that it's not necessarily the bias of the reporters, but what we end up putting on the air. And I'd say I think what we do, is pretty right on. I would say if there's one particular issue that that if the spirit of our coverage tends to be a little bit different, I would say in especially issues of sexuality, I think in particular gay and lesbian issues, when I look at all the polling data of our audience, for the most part, the number one predictor of where you're going to be at is what your parents were at. Where you're going to be a Democrat or if you're going to be a Republican, whether you're going to have particular issues, what your beliefs on particular issues. The one thing that is hugely dramatic amongst our audience is the issue about gay rights. Whether you're in favor of gay marriage, gay adoption, it's a striking shock between people who are 18 to 24 and people who are in their 50s. And I think that our coverage definitely reflects that. Besides that, I think we do a pretty good job. Some in the red zone's got bigger things to worry about than what I'm covering.
You're right there.
Pardon me. I've seen some statistics recently about your demographic and how they're much more active in terms of public affairs and that they have more of their own personal disposable income than any other previous generation has had. Have you seen any kind of an effect in terms of philanthropy and your demographic?
Yeah, I think it's a little early for philanthropy. Just because, I think a lot of our audience is either in college or high school or, in their first jobs. But it's just fascinating when you look. MTV has a very, very serious research department, and they can tell you a lot about our audience. And it's even from, I guess I'm considered Generation X. Even from my generation, it's striking how different things are. But one of the key things is the urge to give back, to be part of the community. And I would say there's definitely a level of cynicism about the political process, but the need, the want to be part of their community, to be involved, is huge. And one of the things that I think is the focus of what we do is to give them those tools, because again, like we talked about, some of the larger issues can be just so daunting and broad and huge, and we really consider it part of our core mission to give them the tools.
Hunter.
Ocean Hunter Riley. My question is about your age. You're 36. You're a father now. Your demographic, you said, is probably ranged from 16 to 24. How do you personally feel about staying in touch with them, and how are you going to continue to stay in touch with them as you get older? Are you going to stay with MTV?
Yeah, I don't know, man. It's definitely something I think about a lot. Except for Kurt and John, I'm actually the oldest person in my department, and there's no doubt about it. We don't have a menudo clause. We don't kick you out at a certain age, but we certainly, we are about youth culture, and you need to have a staff that understands that, that has its finger on it. And I worry about it. I guess I got to move over to VH1 at some point. It's something we think about. I want to, and by the way, if I ever, I think I'm still psyched and interested. I still really like watching things and reading things about, about that audience. But there's moments when I realize I'm not 19. I just don't get it. And at a certain point, if that overwhelms me, it's definitely time to move on, because, I said this before when I was talking to some of the students here. I think the most successful people at MTV are the people who have absolutely no nostalgia. Because the second you're at MTV and you sit around going, oh, dude, remember how cool it was back when we had Beavis and Butthead? Why don't we do that anymore? You're sunk, because artists didn't care. The one group of people who never ask me about music videos are people who are 18 years old. It's only people who are my age who have, and it's just fascinating. People who grew up with MTV, like myself and my friends, they feel an ownership over MTV that they don't feel about anything else. And so when they look at MTV and they see it a different thing than it was when they were young, they are personally offended. It's like, that was mine, and you're screwed with my MTV. Because we always, I want my MTV. We were you, you were us. And so people are, they have that crazy attachment to it. But if you get into that mindset when you work at MTV, you're going to get lost because you got to focus on the new and not the old.
Ocean, I got a question. You talked about the cost of higher ed. Was that at a University of New Hampshire survey that you did? Where did you?
Well, there were two things. One is just in all of our polling, it comes up over and over and over
Is
again.
it
And
all your national polling
yeah,
as well?
Yeah, absolutely. But then, as I was saying, it was just shocking seeing it. Once we were putting together the studio audience for the Edwards thing, it just came up again and again. Again, obviously, it's kids on campus, so you're obviously oversampling. But it's a state school. You'd think it'd be a little bit easier, but still, so many people were just like, I'm going to be so in debt when I get out of here, and I don't know what I'm going to do.
Well, on your national polling, how does it rank with the environment, the war?
Yeah, traditionally it goes back and forth. The war in Iraq, basically the top 5 for us. Let me go back for a second. Yeah, I mean, this globalization is usually not when it's more like jobs comes up. These tend to be this tends to be our list. The war, jobs, globalization, healthcare, higher education, the environment, and then sexuality, sexual health always comes up. You're 17 years old. That's a major part of your life.
Could you talk a bit about who is part of the MTV generation and who's not? Because we know there's a broad group of youth, but could you target who are the youth who are likely to be the MTV audience, and then who's not a part of that audience?
Sure. I mean, broadly speaking, the MTV demo is 16 to 20. It's a little loose, but 16 to 29, maybe 16 to 24. The news department, we tend to skew slightly older, so we consider our audience more along the lines of 17 to 29. Does that make sense? But within that, we try to be something for all young people. Again, it's in this modern media universe. There's so many more niche players that people have a lot more opportunities. So sometimes, I would say right now the channel skews more female to male. Just I think it reflects the programming on the channel. I would say it's really interesting, as far as ethnic breakdowns. I mean, it's a pretty broad swath. I mean, I think, my guess is it tends to be more white than black. But we certainly, the news department, we're not, that doesn't tend to be our demo. But yeah, I mean, in general, we think that if you're a young person, we try to program for you. I know it's pretty broad, but does that answer your question? Do you want me to get more specific? Mm-hmm. Actually, you know what? I would kind of disagree with that because I think that just as far as targeting people, the reality is if you are super active on your college campus and the young Democrats or the young Republicans, a lot of what we do, while we certainly want those people to watch our shows, the reality is that some of the stuff we do, you're already there. I mean, the kids I knew in college, the kids that I meet now who were super dedicated, working on campaigns, they're reading The Economist. They already know a lot of that stuff. We consider our audience the people who are interested, want to know, or they wouldn't be watching the show, but maybe are a little embarrassed that they don't know what a delegate is and they don't want to ask, so we target them. So that I think that tends to be our audience. As far as ethnic breakdowns, that goes by show. I mean, the news department, we really do feel like we kind of target all young people. We do different shows for different people. I always laugh when I talk about Vote or Die, but we worked with Diddy very extensively in the last election to target the urban youth. We did a great show with David Banner about his hometown in Mississippi. We have a whole channel now called MTV Trace, which targets Latinos, and we work with them obviously very extensively and stuff. We just did a big immigration event and show with them about a month ago. So again, we do try to target all groups of young people.
We have time for one more question.
Sorry, I'm taking I'm shorting my answers, I guess.
First off, I wanted to say you don't have to apologize for Made. As a parent, I think it's probably the best show that you have.
Yeah, it was a
should
bad
be
example.
required.
It was,
As a
I think it's a great show too.
Yes.
Yeah.
In the real world, that would be another discussion.
Okay, let's
But,
do.
my question would be I think you guys do a great job on covering politics, but how do you see that translating as far as percentages of young people that actually get out and vote, knowing that most Americans are pretty apathetic when it comes to voting? And also, does the war have any correlation, since we have the mantra, we're going out fighting for other people's freedom to vote, but we don't execute our own right to vote, so.
Yeah, I mean, listen, there's just no doubt about it. When you look at breakdowns of age groups, people who are under the age of 30 have the lowest rate of voting. I'm not going to argue that point. But there are, again, in the 2008. In 2000, 19 million people under the age of 30 voted. We were like, you know what, we'd like to get that to 20. So the kind of the theme of our campaign was 20 million loud. And it's interesting, when we went around and met with the various campaigns, we said, how many people under the age of 30 do you think vote? And 5 million, 6 million, 7 million. And we said, we're at 20, it's going to be 20 million. People are like, wow, that's a huge voting block. It's certainly more than enough to turn an election. Yeah, I mean, listen, I know that no matter what we do, there's going to be people who don't vote, the people who don't want to be involved, whether through apathy or they actively don't want to be part of the system. I understand that. But there's going to be over 20 million people in my demographic who are going to be voting. And I want to be able to be part of their lives and help them make an informed decision. So, I don't really get hung up on the, hey, a lot of young people don't vote, because enough do. And, frankly, our Edwards show last week, the way that it worked is we streamed it live on MTV.com and on MySpace, and then we took it into edit room and we edited it not for content but for time, because we had to, on TV you got to hit your numbers. The ratings that we got for the show were 3 times what we had sold it at. It shocked everybody how well it did. And hey, who knows? Maybe it was the way it was promoted. Maybe I produced a fantastic show. Maybe there's a lot more people interested in Edwards than I would have thought based on the polling numbers. I don't know, but it did really well. It did so well that people were talking about it in the office and at the Clinton Forum. My boss's bosses were like, "Hey, great number on the Edwards show." So, someone's watching. So that's exciting. And by the way, that's in the demo. Outside the demo, I don't even know what the ratings are because I don't care.
Well, that's all the time we have for questions. I think we'll have some time up here to speak with them afterwards. But let's thank Ocean one more time for speaking.
Thank you so much.